Every concept has an equal and opposite concept. We're here this evening to discuss the concept of experimentation. So we must also acknowledge its opposite, confirmation. Let me begin by placing both concepts in the context of art. The history of art has periods of confirmation and experimentation. Any period with the prefix neo is conformational. However, neo is contradictory, since there are no new ideas during these periods. Neo-Gothic and Neoclassical look backward to confirm past ideas. A more accurate prefix would be retro, although retro has come to mean something else. Neo-artists like Canova believed in the ideas of the past. Retro artists like Anne Tainter do not. They treat the past ironically. Let's move from the past tense to the future tense. Like the future, experimentation is unpredictable. The concept of experimentation has several forms. At its basis, it can be argued that doing anything differently from what you do normally is experiment. If you put salt in your coffee instead of sugar, you are experimenting. You're also an idiot. So let me leave the trivial and the idiotic behind and move to a more serious discussion of experimentation in art. Even in the same period of history, some arts are conformational while others are experimental. Ancient Rome, for example, was a period of confirmation in sculpture and experimentation in architecture. Furthermore, history shows us that experiments were mostly theme-based and led to variability. For example, the theme of David was the basis of the variable experiments of Donatello, Michelangelo, and Bernini. Variable experiments based on themes continued into the 18th and 19th centuries. Then a new basis for experimentation occurred. The invention of cast iron was experimented with in architecture. Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace in London was unlike any building that went before. This was not a variation, it was an innovation. By the mid-19th century, themes in art disappeared, and with them, variable experimentation. Modernism sought innovative experiments, and all the arts were radicalized. The pure space of the Renaissance was thrown out by Braque and Picasso, who introduced time-space into painting. It's no coincidence that Einstein's experiments were commensurate with this time. Equally, the mask that sculpture had depended upon since its origin was also thrown out. Sculptors like Archipenko and Garbo transferred their attention to spatial experiments. The invention of steel allowed architects to experiment with a new form, the cantilever. The cantilever gave architecture a dramatic new appearance, as close to levitation as was structurally possible. The floating balconies of Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water are a perfect example. The innovative experimentation pioneered by modernism left a legacy for contemporary art. Take the extraordinary topological spatial experiments of Richard Serra, the deconstructive ideas of Coop Himmelblau, and experiments with light in James Turrell's work. Of course, there are also artists who think that experimentation is like putting salt in your coffee. Tracy Emin, for example. Idiot.
Oh, Gareth! Stop it.
I thought you would like that more.
Hold your questions. Shame.
Do these ideas about confirmation and experimentation in art affect contemporary art education? Even though it has mostly disappeared in art, confirmation still exists in art education. A prime example is the New York Studio School. The founding principle of the school is drawing from the life figure is the basis of artistic development. The school, therefore, looks to the past and promotes traditional ideas. Another example of confirmation can be found when a student's work in the classroom reflects the teacher's work in his or her own studio. The purpose of these classes is for the students to confirm the teacher. Another is when the students are prohibited in exceeding the knowledge of the teacher. Once again, let's move on and discuss experimentation. In art education, as in art, there are variable and innovative experiments. Variable experiments are common. One might say that they are the bread and butter of art education. A teacher begins with a verbal introduction to an idea or phenomenon, and the students give their take on it. We all know this. It's called a project. It's interesting to note that 150 years after modernism rejected visual art's dependence on literary thought, it is still present in art education. Many teachers employ a narrative. They talk about line, plane, form, etc. And yes, this is a narrative taken from the book of Bauhaus, particularly from Paul Klee's notebooks. The advantage of this method of experiment, and perhaps its purpose, is to make the student work evaluative. Since all the students have a common starting point, their work can be directly compared. Without comparability, evaluation is reduced to opinion. Finally, we come to innovative experimentation in education. What if we threw out variable experiment? What if we radicalized art education? Is it possible to have art education without verbal instruction and verbal critiques, without goals and evaluation? The answer is, yes, it is. I know, because I tried it. In 1969, 3 years after I began teaching at St. Martin's School of Art in London, I asked what I think is a naive question. It was, why do we give verbal instructions to students in the classroom when as artists we don't give them to ourselves in the studio? The question provoked 3 other members of faculty, and the 4 of us devised the circumstances for a non-verbal, non-critical, non-goal, non-evaluative first-year program. I haven't time to explain exactly what we did, but I can say this. The program took place in a controlled room, what's become known as the locked room. We began by giving students materials, not words. Our role was to observe, not teach. Students could do what they wanted with the materials or do nothing. They were not allowed to communicate verbally or leave the room during working periods. It's important to understand the scale of this innovative experiment. It didn't just last for weeks. It didn't last for months. It didn't last for the first year. It lasted for 3 whole years. During this time, materials changed, but the students were never informed when, so they could not predict and form goals. There were no critiques on what they did, and at the end of the year, no evaluation. The A course, as it was called, was infamous. Now, as so often happens with innovative experimentation, it is regarded as the most important event in British art education in the latter half of the 20th century. I hope I might be able to say some more during the discussion. I'd like especially to draw attention to pedagogical experimentation as well as academic experimentation.